Time now for Hard Talk.
Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zainab Badawi. June this year marks the 4th anniversary since Julian Assange took refuge in the Embassy of Ecuador in London to avoid extradition to Sweden over sexual assault claims there which he denies. His WikiLeaks website published hundreds of thousands of classified military and diplomatic documents leaked by a US military intelligence analyst, and Mr. Assange claims he could end up being sent to the US for trial for espionage. My guest is Guillaume, the newly appointed Foreign Minister of Ecuador. How can his country claim to be defending transparency and freedom of expression by granting Mr. Assange political asylum when his government stands accused of systematically and extensively violating press freedoms at home? Guillaume, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Do you believe that Julian Assange will be leaving the Ecuadorian Embassy in London soon?
I'd very much like him to. I fear for his health. I fear for his integrity. He's been in there for 4 years. That's a very long time. And we've been arguing, Ecuador's been pushing forward the view that it should be resolved briefly, that it should be resolved swiftly. We think it's possible. We need a few guarantees to make sure that there's no political persecution and Assange can be on his way.
Because Marion Nye, the Swedish prosecutor, has said that she is willing to have him questioned inside the embassy, and the UK has given its permission, waiting for a response from Ecuador. So why won't you give that? Because then you could get the resolution you've just said you wanted.
Well, that's a very recent development. It's a development of the last few weeks. We've been asking this for 4 years, over 1,400 days asking for the Swedes to go into the embassy.
But you've had this response a few weeks. Isn't that enough time for you to get
our lawyers are working on it. We're happy that at last we've had this request. But let's not forget that there's a major game changer here, which is the UN resolution that establishes that Julian Assange is it's been held now for 4 years under arbitrary detention. This is something with major legal repercussions. It's not something minor. It's a UN body, a highly respected UN body that calls on the British and Swedish authorities to respect this and says that Mr. Assange is being held in an arbitrary way. This also has legal
That's the UN Working Group
yeah.
report that you are referring to. I'll come to that in a second, but just to reiterate, will you allow Mr. Assange to be questioned inside the embassy?
Well, the initial intention is just that, but just as the Swedish say this is a judicial matter, we in Ecuador also say it's a judicial matter, so it's a decision for our Attorney General to take, not my decision. It's just arrived. We've been waiting 4 years for this to arrive. It's just arrived a few days ago, so we'll be taking a decision in the coming days based on the global judicial case, which includes the UN arbitrary detention resolution.
So you started off by saying, you fear for Mr. Assange's integrity, his health. He's been in your embassy for 4 years and so on, and yet you have the ability, the authorities in Ecuador, to bring a resolution by allowing him to be questioned, and you're sitting on this and you don't know how it's going to.
No, we're not sitting on this at all. This arrived a few days ago. We've been waiting 4 years for this to come. Ecuador's been saying systematically, we can resolve this through having the guarantees that he won't be extradited to a third country.
That's what you're waiting for, because your predecessor, Ricardo Patino, said that's the guarantee he wants from the Swedes and Britain, that Julian Assange will not be extradited to the US.
That would be very good, yes. We'd very much like that.
That's really what you're saying. That's the condition.
What we've been saying for 4 years is that the Swedes could interrogate him in our embassies. They've done this on many occasions. In fact, they've addressed 44 requests in the time that Assange has been in our embassy to interrogate different people in different contexts. So they've been doing it all the time. They weren't doing it with Ecuador. It took them 4 years. And there's a major game changer. In January, the UN said he was being held in arbitrary detention. Now, lawyers will tell you that arbitrary detention and a resolution by the UN in this case is not a minor issue. So it has to be analysed in the context.
Lawyers, there are lawyers and there are lawyers. And as you know, you have different opinions. Mark Ellis, who's the executive director of the International Bar Association, a global outfit based here in the UK, says of the UN working report, it's important to maintain adherence to the rule of law principle and ensure that individuals have to abide by legal rulings. It's surprising to think that Assange could be exempted from those principles. The ruling by the UN panel is not binding on British law.
Yeah, well, there's an irony there because Britain and Sweden have constantly called on all other countries to abide to this UN ruling. Now, it's in this case, because it affects their behaviour, they're saying it's not binding.
He's not nothing to do with the British government. He's from the International Bar Association.
That's his opinion,
he's a lawyer.
Many lawyers will tell you that it is binding.
Yeah, but there are lawyers and there are lawyers, and this
Absolutely.
is a fairly authoritative voice when it comes to legal opinion.
Well, I've spoken to lots of authoritative voices that say that it's a tremendous paradox and an irony that this UN ruling, which the UK and Sweden have called on many, many countries in many instances to abide to, suddenly has been deemed non-binding. I think it's a little bit ironic. I think it's time for the UK, and let's not forget the UK is on the UN Council of Human Rights, and in 2006, in order to be elected on this Council of Human Rights, the United Kingdom said, we pledged our full commitment to abide to any human rights UN ruling, and this is one of them.
But it's not just the UK, it's Sweden. I mean, these aren't countries that violate, human rights principles.
And
you're talking about no, I wasn't saying that you were, but I'm just saying that you're talking about two countries that are mature democracies with independent judiciaries and so on. No, I'm not saying compared to Ecuador, but when a UK government spokesman says in response to the findings of the UN working group, Julian Assange has never been arbitrarily detained by the UK. He is in fact voluntarily avoiding lawful arrest by choosing to remain in the Ecuadorian Embassy. And, this is a serious point that's being made here. An allegation of rape is still outstanding, the British government spokesman says, and a European arrest warrant is in place, so the UK has a legal obligation to extradite him to Sweden. So that's the British government's
But it's the same
position.
problem when you talk about law. I mean, there's international law. Now, you can't just say, well, I agree with this ruling, so I abide to international law, or I disagree with this ruling and I won't abide to international law. It's international law.
What do you think?
And the UK and Sweden should abide to it.
He is wanted for questioning over serious allegations.
And we've never had a problem with that.
But
we've always said we won't stand in the way of any case in Sweden. We take all allegations seriously.
But you want the condition that he won't be extradited to the
Mr.
US.
Assange
but you are therefore obstructing
Mr. Assange
justice in a way, aren't you?
Revealed things that are very, very serious. He revealed not just the cable leaks, he revealed massacres against civilians in Iraq. There are a number of things, the whole Guantanamo files. These are not minor things. We live in the real world.
Are rape allegations a minor thing, Foreign Minister? Are rape allegations, I'm not saying whether he's guilty or not, this is not the purpose of this interview, but aren't rape allegations a very serious matter?
They're extremely serious, which is why we don't have a problem with the Swedish case. We ask for two things. Guarantees for him not to be extradited to a third country. This has nothing to do with the rape allegations. And an interrogation process in our embassy, which has taken 4 years to materialise when usually it takes a few days in the case of other countries. We finally had a request in the last few days, and we're going to deal with it because obviously this is a legal matter. Just like the Swedes say it's a legal matter, we as a government can't take all these decisions.
But your position is very clear. You started off by saying, we fear for the health and integrity of Julian Assange.
That's right. If this had been the other way around, and Ecuador was in breach of a UN ruling, this would be a scandal. I would be sitting here and you would say, why are you not abiding to the UN ruling?
I wouldn't be saying that.
International law.
You're telling me what I would be saying. I wouldn't. But why do you fear for his health?
Well, I mean, he's been in there 4 years. It's a very small space. A number of medical doctors have been analysing his situation. I mean, this is a really inhumane, which is why the UN called it arbitrary detention and have a specific decision.
But I mean, his health. To say you're worried about his health is a very, very serious matter.
Well,
I mean,
I saw him yesterday. He's okay, but he has a problem in his arm. He's got deteriorating health. There are all sorts of issues.
He needs hospital treatment.
Issues.
Does he need hospital treatment?
This is not for me to decide, but yes, we're concerned about his health. He doesn't have access to good healthcare. I mean, that's clear. Absolutely. I mean, we're very worried about this, and after 4 years, there's a clear deterioration.
President Rafael Correa in February told a news conference, do you know how much it costs to maintain security at the embassy? I mean, is Ecuador getting a bit fed up?
Very fed up. It's an embassy under siege. You try and make a phone call from the embassy to see if that's worked. It's probably one of the most spied-on embassies in the world. So, yeah, it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant for the people working in the embassy. This is not a decision that's easy for Ecuador, because Ecuador is a small country. We took this decision based on our principles, on our humanitarian principles, and because we believed Assange's physical integrity was at risk. This is a human rights
You offered
decision.
him political... Okay.
Despite the fact that we know that in an international system, with a number of players, with a number of states, the UK, Sweden, obviously a big part of it, but also the United States. This is something difficult to sustain for Ecuador, but based on a principled decision, we took the decision to ask for these guarantees for him not to be extradited.
And no regrets, no regrets about what's happened.
And find
no
out
regrets.
whether there's an extradition process,
Yeah.
we cannot confirm or deny answers. You know, from the Foreign Office, from the United States, we cannot confirm or deny whether there's an extradition request. It's something which is obviously unsettling for us.
So this could go on for a long time. I mean, do you have any regrets that you did offer him?
No, I think we did the right thing, and I think time has proven us right.
You did the right thing, and some would say, your critics would say, that the irony is that Ecuador is presenting itself as this champion of freedom of speech, transparency, when there have been lots of criticisms about freedom of speech and expression and the role of the media in Ecuador. So I'll give you just one example. There are so many. Editorial director of Vanguardia, which is a weekly printed magazine, Juan Carlos Calderon, said, the government says it's granted asylum to Julian Assange because he's politically persecuted for defending freedom of expression, but this is not a country with the free press described by President Rafael Correa.
Yes, well, I completely disagree with that, and I completely disagree with that media campaign. If you go to Ecuador, you'll see absolute freedom of expression. Their press is, by and large, in Ecuador, in the hands of private media, about 90%. There is a small public sector, much smaller than the BBC. We wish it was bigger, but much smaller public press and media sector than in this country. The press is very linked to these big, large Murdoch-type monopolies. There's a lot of very right-wing, kind of very aggressive
So that's
Fox
a legitimate
News.
position to have
It's
to
there,
hold.
and it's not. There's
But that's
no
the
type
point,
of
is that
censorship. There's no type of censorship
All right.
whatsoever. We do have a regulatory body that didn't exist before, just like you have one in this country. So if there's racism or sexism or hate
Okay, that's normal. That's normal. That's
normal.
normal.
Exactly
But
what we're talking about.
But it isn't actually.
It's exactly
So
what we're talking
I'll just
about.
tell you.
Because this
but it's
didn't
not.
exist before, and now
Yeah,
it does exist. Obviously, there's been some backlash on behalf of our press, and unfortunately.
Well, it's not just your press. You've got international critics as well, haven't you? You know, Index on Censorship, Reporters Without Borders, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Frank LaRue, has said of this law that you've just brought up, Media and Communications in 2013, that some of the law's provisions are unacceptable. He says, I also reiterate my concern over the fact that the law was not submitted to a broader debate with society's other actors, including journalists and media outlets.
Well, I
criticism.
completely disagree with them. The law was extremely participative. It was approved through our Congress. It's absolutely legitimate. Actually, if you really look at the law, it's very similar to European laws, where you have a regulatory body.
Yeah, I just said that there is that, but the point is...
Debates about freedom of expression in this country with the tapping of the phones and the whole news of the world scandal. These are similar issues we're facing in Ecuador. Very similar.
But he's actually saying it goes beyond that,
He may be saying that, but the thing is, in Latin America, there has been no regulation. There has been no history of this kind of public accountability of the press in society. And the media, let's not forget there's a context here, the Ecuadorian context, have very close tie to old 19th century plantation elites who are not very happy with the reform process which is underway in Ecuador. So obviously they've become political actors, they've become a political opposition, and instead of trying to bring politicians to accountability, which is what media should do, they've become politicians themselves.
Yeah, but you've just dismissed this. I mean, 1 minute, a minute ago, talking about Julian Assange, you're saying, oh, the UN working report on Assange's situation is great.
But this is legally binding. You're talking to me about an opinion.
But it's still a UN special rapporteur. It's still the UN body.
There's a meeting of the UN Council next week, which will have a binding finding on freedom of expression. In the case of Ecuador, I'm going to Geneva myself. We can talk after that, but right now this is just an opinion.
It's UN a la carte, though, isn't it? I mean, he's a highly respected person, but anyway, all right.
Highly respected, but there are UN bodies. International law is international law.
Let me give you some of the examples.
Highly respected or not.
So, give you some examples of why people say that press freedom is really constrained in your country. Vistazo magazine, September 2012, publishes an article which advocates a no vote against President Correa. It was to do with a referendum, and what happens is fined $80,000. Give you another example. Website for Republican online publication, Equavisa TV station, Vistazo magazine, again in June 2015, all broadcast live footage of social protests, and their websites were disabled for several hours.
No, that's not true. But in this country,
you can't just say that.
You have the media get fined all the time. You have libel cases all the time in the United Kingdom. It's very similar to what happens in Ecuador. This didn't happen before, okay? So the media are obviously surprised that suddenly they're held to account. This didn't happen in Ecuador.
You're holding to account for libel, defamation, so on. That's
exactly what we're talking about. Those kinds of fines are exactly what we're talking about.
Well, it's not. And you have President Correa, I mean, you know, regularly tears up newspapers. Lahore, he did that November 2015 most recently, denouncing what he calls the corrupt press.
Well, there is a corrupt press, and he's denounced it, but there's been no censorship.
On his national broadcast TV.
You have to differentiate a political conflict between our government and some extreme right-wing press that spends its time criticizing us, that has very aggressive headlines, a lot of racist, sexist, hate headlines. That would be fined in this country.
Racist, sexist would be fined,
but this is what we're talking
not
about.
Criticism
you need to see
of
the Latin American
government.
media.
Not criticisms of government, but not criticism of government and government policy.
It's very aggressive press. And then you have President Correa, who fights back. Now, the media are not used to this.
By tearing up newspapers.
By saying they're lying, by saying this is wrong, by saying this is completely unacceptable, but certainly not by censoring. There's a difference here.
All right, okay.
You can answer the media, and which is very different from having censorship. There is no censorship in Ecuador. If you go tomorrow, you'll see all the newspaper in the booths saying very nasty things about the government without any consequence.
Okay, as I said, there are opinions within and outside Ecuador that beg to differ with you. Not only is it critics about the press freedoms, you've also got now protests, anti-government protests in Ecuador, particularly from indigenous people, the very people whom President Correa says he championed when he first came to power about a decade ago. That is very serious for you. You've got them saying, you know, water rights are being violated. I'll give you one example. Carlos Perez Guartambel, president of the Equinari, representing the Kicha people, says of water rights, the water is in the hands of multinationals that commercialise bottled water. You've got people protesting against oil exploration rights in a remote part of the Amazon rainforest that has been given to the Chinese. These are your natural constituency, you're alienating.
With whom we got 65% of the votes in the first round. The indigenous people are a huge majority of indigenous people support our government. Now, the last protests you referred to were in June last year. I actually think that in the European context, they're much more frequent and much more large-scale protests. But the large protests were in June.
The nature of the protests?
They were basically middle-class protests against tax reform, right? They weren't indigenous protests.
That was part of it.
Yes.
You had last year, as you said, thousands blocked roads in 6 of the country's provinces against the 80%. A year ago, June last year, 80% inheritance tax and raising real estate levies. But you also had poor people protesting against proposed reductions in welfare payments.
Yes, no, not at all. That's not true.
With the poor?
No, reductions in welfare payments.
But aren't there going to be reductions in welfare payments because of the constraints in the economy?
If you had a look at the demonstrations last year in June, and they were very violent. There was a number of police officers that were wounded, over 110. There was a police officer that was kidnapped and tortured. Imagine what that would mean in a European context. But I would say, by and large, obviously there were thousands of people out on the street protesting these taxes, so there was a wide array from all different aspects of society. But by and large, if you look at those protests, they were middle-class and upper-class protests.
The oil exploration, though, the indigenous people are annoyed about the rights
Well,
given.
I've just said, I mean, indigenous people...
you do well.
We do very well electorally. I'm sure there's some indigenous people that are in favour, some people that are against. You know, indigenous people shouldn't be romanticised as this kind of entity. They all agree with each other, they all vote together. No, you have indigenous people that vote right-wing, indigenous people that vote left-wing.
He's popular, but his ratings are going down, aren't they? From beginning of January last year to December 2015, he saw a drop in his poll ratings from 60 to 41%.
Well, our different pollsters would have different results. The last polls I saw, he was still above 60%. President Correa has been in power.
That was over a whole year, and it was by
Sedatos. For 10 years, and I think what is surprising here is how, well, it'll be 10 years next February, so 9.5 years. What is surprising in this story is how consistent his popularity has been over 10 years. I don't know a lot of presidents.
Might go down now, though, because the economy is really taking a hammering, isn't it? Oil prices obviously going down. You use the US dollar, which is quite strong regionally, which means your exports are going to be much more expensive and your imports, you know, are easier, but your exports are. You're going to suffer trying to diversify your economy because you can't
I think we've been through the worst. Oil prices are on the rise, and I think we handled it very well. This is an important point. I think if this collapse of the oil price had happened 15 or 20 years, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the situation would have been disastrous. Let's not forget that Ecuador, before our government, had 7 presidents in 10 years.
Sure.
It was famous in the world for being very unstable, massive economic crisis, etc. This hasn't happened. What we're seeing now is Ecuador dealing quite well with the fall in oil prices. We even grew last year, very marginally. We were used to growing 5% a year, and unfortunately we grew 0.5%, which was unfortunate. But in the past, it would have been chaos. Teachers wouldn't have been paid, police officers, army wouldn't have been paid. We'd have had people on the streets. This didn't happen. Why? Because we're diversifying our economy. We're moving away from oil. We're taking the right steps.
You still rely on oil for 50% of your exports.
Yes, you can't change that in 9 years. We've been relying on raw materials for 500.
Foreign Minister, the fact is when you look at the region, progressive governments of the sort that you support, you subscribe to that ideology, are really hugely under pressure, especially Venezuela. You know, Nicolas Maduro there took over from Hugo Chavez. Look at what's going on there. Medicines in short supply, food shortages, hospitals running out of soap. Inflation last year was 180%. The progressive left are really not being able to deliver economic benefits to the people, the very people who brought them to power.
You just mentioned Venezuela. In the case of Ecuador, there is no inflation. I think every different setting will have a very different...
Yeah, but progressive governments, those left of centre, are under pressure, aren't they, including yours?
There's an effort to present the progressive governments as a failure because now there's some changes, electoral changes, some right-wing government have come into power.
Like in Peru,
I think that when Peru...
the president,
there's a new president, although I don't know whether the previous government was part of the progressive wave. But the truth is, for the last 10, 15 years, these progressive governments have been very successful at reducing inequality, at reducing poverty, at giving political stability to these governments. And because this is a democratic game, and absolutely legitimate democratic game, you have changes. So you have new governments, some more right, some more centre coming to power. I think in the case of Ecuador, the coming February, which is the coming presidential elections, we'll see a renewed victory of our progressive front.
OK, and those coming presidential elections, the constitution has been changed so that actually there's no limit on presidential terms.
Yes, there is, only 2 terms.
Yeah, but after 2070, after the next elections, there is no after the next elections. So Rafael Correa can't run in the next elections, but after 4 years, he could run again, couldn't he?
Just like in Brazil, in Argentina, in Russia, in this country, there are no limits. In most,
but he couldn't he run again after 4 years?
This is some question you'd have to ask Rafael Correa because it's a very personal decision. I don't know whether he'll do that.
Finally and briefly, I have to ask you a personal question. You've got a British father, hence your surname Long, French mother, hence your first name Guillaume. You moved to Ecuador when you were 20. Can you really understand, empathise with the poor who you say you champion in Ecuador?
Well, I went to Latin America when I was 18, actually, and I was in Ecuador when I was 19. I've lived most of my life now in Ecuador. All my life has been
Can you empathise, though, really feel what the people experience?
I'd lived in a lot of places in Ecuador. I've been a political militant all my life. I wasn't always in government. I was a long time in opposition, working with the very indigenous groups you were talking about. So I can empathise, and that's why we're involved in this process.
Foreign Minister of Ecuador, Guillaume Long, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk. Thank you.